South Africa's total new vehicle sales increased by 6.4% year-on-year to just over 52,000 units in February. Naamsa says that the outlook for 2012 was for modest growth in total industry sales, helped by relatively low interest rates for consumers and an improvement in vehicle affordability. Joining me in studio to discuss the new vehicle sales data is Jeff Osbourne, CEO of the retail motor industry. Very warm welcome to you, Jeff.
Okay.
Jeff, this is not a bad number considering to where we're coming from. And I think I interviewed you in the crux of the recession. So having the numbers that we're getting now from not just South Africa, from other parts of the world, it seems as though we're improving quite significantly.
No, indeed, I think very pleasing. Also bearing in mind that we've come off a high base, if you like. The percentages have come down somewhat on what we saw last year, but the actual numbers are quite significant. And if you consider that last month, January this year, was in fact the highest number of vehicle sales recorded since September 2007. So against that perspective, any growth on that is really good.
Let's just talk a little bit about where you see future growth coming from, because one of our huge trade partners, the EU, still in crisis. So it doesn't seem as though we're going to be getting much growth from them for quite a while. And one of the bright spots, it seems, in this story is investment into other African countries, and that vehicle sales could be seeing growth in that part of the world.
I think it's a very realistic assumption, and you're quite right. In Europe, we have seen a cooling off of our exports. I think we're down 10.5%. But that, I might add, could be bolstered by the fact that there will be some significant new export from Ford and both BMW. They're bolstering their export programs. But I think there has been a long-held view that Africa is where the future lies. If one considers the fact that given the very significant levels of investment in our manufacturing sector here in South Africa by major vehicle manufacturers, kind of surprising in the sense that we are far from the markets. So logistically, there's often been a view that we're not optimally placed for that. But I think that one of the reasons for those investments has been, as I say, a long-held view that the future lies within the African market. And I think we can safely assume that we are going to see an increase in exports to other African countries.
You say to me that Nigeria, obviously, that seems to be where a lot of interest is going, but you also mentioned Uganda, that is also seen as a really ripe for opportunity.
I think there are a number of African countries where things are coming right economically, and we're seeing stability and growth. So I think it's very realistic to expect exports to improve across the manufacturing spectrum. But in particular, the fact that we are well positioned, given the fact that we are manufacturing so many different models and derivatives in this country.
I want to talk a little bit about Mercedes, because sometimes, that when we look at these numbers, sometimes they're not included. For instance, we would have excluded their numbers. They were included this time, but also not a complete number from Mercedes. If we did have their numbers, what do you think? Do you think we would have a better than 6.4% year on year?
No, in fact, we've had a look at that. If we factor in the aggregate Mercedes numbers, it takes it up to 8.7. And of course, what they're not giving us is the breakdown of those numbers. But if you take their total aggregate sales, it's actually 8.7 year to date, which is quite pleasing, in fact, extremely pleasing.
One of the things that we saw at the height of the recession, when it came to the new vehicle sales being really hit, we did see some improvement from the second-hand car environment, for instance. And also, I remember speaking to you, and you were saying there was a huge opportunity for the service, side of the business. When we look at new vehicle sales now, what do you think is going to happen to those sectors of the industry?
Yes. Well, I think what the trend has been, although we've seen this recovery, if you like, it has been most definitely a down buying trend, because in real terms new vehicle prices have been contained in negative territory. So the gap between the used car prices and new has widened somewhat, and I think the bargains, and also the fact that there's such a competitive market out there at the moment, that the consumer has been drawn and attracted towards the new car market again, albeit smaller vehicles, which is all based on affordability. And he was talking earlier on about the situation, the uncertainty surrounding, the concerns surrounding the price of fuel, and that's a very real one. So I think consumers are astutely looking at what it's going to cost to run a car, not only now but going forward. So I think to answer your question, the used car market has been pretty dormant, a little bit of growth, but not that dramatic. But the trend has been a move towards new car. Also, I believe, because despite the fact that people were driving their cars for longer because of the criteria that existed at the time, they're now in a position or situation, as was the case last year, where they simply have to replace them. So I think quite a bit of that pent-up replacement demand is still coming through.
I want to talk a little bit about affordability. We were speaking to Ford earlier on in the year, and when just looking at their numbers, it seemed as though their small passenger vehicles doing much, much better than their larger motor vehicles. And all over the world, it's not just in terms of affordability, but we're also getting this concern of what's happening to the environment. Going forward, where do you think the opportunity is mostly for auto manufacturers? On the smaller side of the vehicles, or are we looking, with things improving? And also looking at the oil price now, and that's not going to ease anytime soon. Where do you think that consumers are going to be buying?
No, I think you're right. Things will never be the same again. There is certainly a major drive to create more fuel-efficient vehicles, hybrids and so on. But predominantly we're seeing these in the smaller vehicle sector because, against the norm that the bigger the engine, the more fuel it consumes. So I think the way of the future is towards smaller vehicles, and also against the background that the modern entry-level, so-called entry-level smaller vehicle has got all the bells and whistles, which they didn't have 5-10 years ago. They've got power steering, aircon, it's all there, and you can cruise at the same speed with the same levels of comfort that one experiences in bigger vehicles. And you're right, it's not just a South African trend. In the American market, where they've always been kind of extravagant and they've disregarded the cost and the consumption of fuel, huge trend and move towards smaller vehicles and less gas guzzling type of vehicles. So I think your question is quite right. Smaller vehicles is the way of the future.
Let's talk a little bit about what is happening in the US. They released their numbers, 6.6 year-on-year growth there, the base that they've done in 4 years. It was much better than what analysts and even people in the industry were expecting could. And when we look at our forecast, people that are in the industry saying, we could see very modest growth. Do you think that we could probably get better than expected numbers going forward?
I tend to be bullish. In fact, that was the case last year, for what it's worth, when the pundits were saying around about 12%, I think the best I heard was 12%, we said a minimum 15%, and we weren't far out. It was at the end of the year at 15.6. So at the moment, there's a lot of suggestion it's going to be single digit, as low as 5%, I've heard one bank saying. Our view is that more likely 10, 11%.
Very, very bullish. Thank you so much, Mr. Osbourne. That was Jeff Osbourne, and he's CEO of RMI.